they will click on a link in the show notes if you direct them to that. So what I always say is you want to make it as easy as you possibly can for the listener to take the next step in your process, to do the thing that you're asking them to do.
Hey everyone, this is Mark DeGrasse, the president of Digital Marketer, and this is the podcast that keeps you up to date on everything you need to know when it comes to digital marketing, from the platforms you're focused on to the cutting edge tactics and tools that are working today. Today, our guest is Kevin Chemidlin, who worked with over 400 clients to 4 to 10x their audience in 6 months. Today, we're going to be talking about how to convert your podcast listeners into buyers and also how to proactively grow your show, which as a podcast producer, personally myself, I don't do a great job at. I just come out with episodes. So welcome, Kevin. Glad to have you here.
Yeah, good to be here, Mark. Pumped to dive in.
All right. So let's just start with kind of converting those listeners into buyers, because I think for actually most content methods in general, it's the last thing that people think about. They think, okay, I got to come out with good content, got to make it entertaining, got to do all these, get professional mic setups and all these things. And the last thing they think about is, how is this actually going to make me money? So how do you kind of start that conversation with your clients?
Yeah, right. It's funny because a lot of people do get to that point. They get to the 1 yard line and they don't get that last yard of actually getting revenue from their show. So where the first thing that we start with is a podcaster's premise. Is it really, really clear who their show is serving? And is it at least similar to their back-end business, assuming that the podcaster we're talking to has a product or service to sell? So we start there and say, okay, what is it that you're looking to drive customers to? What do you want your listeners to become buyers of? Is there congruence between that and your podcast? And if so, then oftentimes we jump to the end, which is, okay, how are you talking about your products and services on your podcast? And are you doing it in a way that makes the listener actually want to learn more about it? The biggest thing that I see people miss is that podcasters don't mention their products or services on their podcast. So I'll be talking to a podcaster and they'll be like, oh, none of my listeners have become customers. And I'm like, okay, great. Well, how are you CTAing your business? And they're like, yeah, I'm really not doing too much of that. And I'm like, well, I've got great news. I know exactly what your problem is. So honestly, like that's the first step, actually talking about your business and your products and services on the show.
Oh, well, I love how you start with like, okay, let's see your podcast and see if it's even related to what you sell or do, because a lot of times it isn't. And people think that, I think they try to go more of the awareness / entertainment route. Like, okay, I'm going to make people know, like, and trust me, and then they'll magically hire me for the thing. So
yeah,
Okay.
I was going to say, the other thing that I see is that generally, as an entrepreneur, when they start a podcast, they want to talk about whatever they want. Like they want to talk about a wide variety of topics. They want to interview people from all walks of life. And so they try to make their show all encompassing so that they have freedom to talk about whatever they want. But what I try to help them to understand is that it's actually easier to talk about whatever you want when you have a specific premise behind your show. When you say like, this show is specifically to help these people achieve this thing. Within that lens, you can talk about finance and entrepreneurship and personal development and all that stuff. And so you still get to talk about all those things, but then also it's just way more clear what your listener is going to get out of it, and way more clear how that your podcast is the first step to them eventually, becoming a happy customer of your products.
Oh, I love that. Well, if you do have that situation where, say, somebody has a podcast that's really unrelated to what they actually do, is it possible to save that podcast? Or at that point, do you just say like, hey, we should really start from scratch and kind of refocus your efforts versus kind of adapting what they're currently doing to what they're selling?
Yeah, I mean, well, first I was like basically point out what we just said and say, okay, given this information, if you really want this thing to drive business to your show, or sorry, if you really want this thing to drive customers to your business, you're probably going to have to change the focus and the premise a little bit. Are you cool with that? And I kind of gauge that. Some people are like, oh, totally, like, yeah, that makes tons of sense, and they rebrand. Others are like, I kind of want to keep this thing a little bit separate, and then it's like, okay, well, then we should probably launch if you really like, if the goal here is to get customers, then we should probably launch a new show that actually is about whatever it is that you do. That scenario is extremely rare. 9 times out of 10, I'm talking with an entrepreneur and their show is about success or, stories. And I'm like, hey, let's say you're a web design entrepreneur. you know that if you, a lot of times they're already talking about that on their show anyway, like their show kind of is a web design show, even though it's branded as success and whatever. So I'm like, hey, let's just like peel away the vagueness of your premise right now and just get to the core of what you're already doing. And that's most cases where the entrepreneur doesn't actually have to change too much about their show. And they do the rebrand and their audience is actually thrilled because they're like, yes, that's what I'm here for. Like this is what we want. And then they become customers. So it's actually a lot easier to readjust than it seems.
Yeah, well, and I think with podcasting and like some other forms of content, you're making so much of it that you can pivot at some point, and you'll take along most of your audience on the new journey where you make it worthwhile. Now, in that regards, have you found that a specific call to action seems to work better? Like, is it a swipe file or a PDF download, or is it more of a introduction to a service, or what kind of success rates do you have with different types of calls to action?
Yeah. So what I recommend is having what I call rotational CTAs, which basically means that you've got 4 to 6 calls to action that you just rotate out every single episode. And so one of them might be a lead magnet, like a PDF or, maybe like a video sales letter, masterclass type of thing, where it's this, discrete piece of value and the listener gives you their email in exchange to get this piece of value. Another type of CTA you can do is to just basically CTA whatever the first step in your sales process is. So like for my accelerator program, for those who want to learn more about working with me in my program, you fill out an application. So, 1 week I might CTA on my own podcast, Grow the Show, about my hour-long masterclass, which, you must opt in to receive the value. And then the next week I'll say, hey, we're taking on entrepreneurs. We've got 10 spots this month for entrepreneurs to join the Grow the Show Accelerator. If you're interested in learning more, fill out an application. The link is in the show notes, blah, blah, blah. And the key when you do a rotational CTA is that you don't see what I see a lot of entrepreneurs do is they call to action their product or their service. Like they just kind of go for the jugular on the podcast and they're like, here's why you should, hire me as a coach. Where that's kind of skipping too many steps, right? It's like you got to go a really long way to take a casual podcast listener and right there in 60 seconds, pitch them, right? And they're not even there with you. So what I recommend is have one of your rotational CTAs to sell the next step or the first step in your sales process. So when you hear me talk about applying to my accelerator program on my podcast, you won't hear me say like, here's why you should join and here's what you're going to get and here are the features. I'm just like, I might say a little bit about what the program is, but I'll say like applying to the program is the best next step because that's going to help us to understand where you are and we can make a recommendation based on where you're at as to what you can do next, right? So I sold applying to the program. I didn't sell to the listener to actually join the program right there. So those two things combined is number one, sell the next step in the process rather than the thing itself. And number two, have rotating CTAs because some of your listeners are going to need to consume a lead magnet in order before they like consider taking the next step. Others, they're ready to go. They're just ready for you to ask them to book a discovery call or whatever it is. So that's kind of the approach that we take.
Oh, that's huge. I love the rotating CTAs because a lot of times it does get annoying if you're like, oh, he's pitching the whatever again versus, if you do have 5 or 6, then you could probably categorize them and make sure that, whatever podcast, digital marketing, we might have like a content podcaster. Okay, let's talk about our content certification, which you'll probably hear an ad for the content cert from this podcast just automatically.
Right.
Which is huge. So you keep it interesting and don't make it so, hammering one point so much. And then I also love how you did applying for the step versus buy or join or anything that's more of a direct call to action. This is no, apply, see if it even makes sense for you. Much softer, easier to say, and less intimidating for the listener who might be like, oh, well, I'm not buying anything. I'm just applying to find out more. And there you go.
Yeah. I've had several clients who come to me and their funnel is a discovery call funnel. So they don't have an application, but it's a discovery call to take the next step. And we've had several occasions where all we needed to change with the way that they're CTAing their business is instead of them selling the coaching program and then saying the next step is to book a call, to just selling the call and saying, hey, book a discovery call and here's what we're going to be able to do together. And if it makes sense for us to work together, I'll tell you what that looks like. But if it doesn't, I'm still going to make sure you leave that call with some takeaways. Just that little adjustment of language. We had one client, Barton, who he was getting crickets. Like he every single week was talking about book a discovery call, book a discovery call. And he was selling his coaching in the CTA. He came in, we adjusted it, just sell the call. And within 1 week, he had 6 discovery calls booked. So it really, really goes a long way. It's subtle, but it goes a long way.
Oh, no, that's huge. And that's a great tip just by itself, where it's like, oh yeah, just mention, cut down the steps, stop making people leap over a, ravine. And instead like, no, it's just a crack in the sidewalk. Jump here. Yeah. And then we'll get to the other point.
Yeah, my dirty little secret is that this applies not only to podcast CTAs, but any CTA, social media, stories, email, just CTA the next step in the sell the next step in the funnel, and you're gonna have a lot more people go through the funnel.
Yeah, but even first, just mentioning it, because I remember when I had a gym back in the 2000s, back in Orange County, and we did YouTube videos. Like that was our big thing, is YouTube videos. And sometimes we'd have somebody who'd come in, they'd be like, "Oh my gosh, I finally clicked on your website and realized that your gym is down the street from me, and you guys just never mentioned it on your videos." And now I'm like, holy crap. And then you get these new clients. So just talking about the thing you sell sometimes is enough. So that's a huge tip. I hate to interrupt our podcast, but I have an announcement about Digital Marketer's content certification. Content without a content marketing strategy is an expensive mistake, but it's one that most businesses are making. When it comes to content marketing, all content should be created with a clear purpose to move a customer or potential customer along the customer value journey. That's why you need Digital Marketer's Content Mastery certification. You'll learn how to leverage a complete content system to strategize, create, and distribute content that just plain works. When you become a certified content marketing strategist, you'll master the craft of systematically creating and promoting content that drives noticeable revenue for any business, and you'll get a badge to prove it. Learn more right now at digitalmarketer.com/content-cert. Now, on the technical side of the call to action. So for, most podcasts, you could interrupt your own podcast, be like, hey guys, oh, that actually reminds me. And then you lead into just kind of like a live commercial. Then you have kind of the cutting commercials. Then you have the bookend commercials. How do you usually recommend people insert the call to action? Should it be their voice delivering it, or is it better to hire somebody? What are the best practices?
Yeah, I definitely recommend that it's their voice, right? That it's especially because it's oftentimes the host of the podcast is also the founder of the business, right? And read ads in podcasting far and beyond always perform the best. So no matter whether it's your business sponsoring your show, right, or another business, host read ads perform better. As far as where to put the call to action, pretty much what I don't recommend is putting it at the beginning or at the end. Because the problem with the end is that the end is the part of the episode that has the fewest amount of people listening to it. If you ever look at your completion rates in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, a really, 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 really great completion rate is like 80 to 90%, meaning like listeners get through that much on average. And that's like phenomenal, which means that only 90% of the people who press play hear that CTA. What I have found is that the vast majority of entrepreneurs who haven't really thought about the strategy of keeping listeners' attention, they just kind of, monkey see, monkey do, whatever another podcast that they listen to does, which that podcast tends to not have good completion rates. A lot of times we link up with a podcaster and their completion rate is like, 40%, which is, first of all, a really bad sign. You want to fix that before fixing growth and monetization, because that just means that people are not listening. They're pressing play, you're getting downloads, but they're not actually listening. But if you have a completion rate of even 60%, that means 40% of the people who tuned in, if your CTA is at the end, never heard that. They never heard you talk about the thing. So I don't recommend putting it at the end. Not a lot of podcasters do that though. A lot of them put it right at the very beginning, like pre-roll, like press play, first thing. Now, while that you would think that that's a good idea because 100% of people will hear that, what I don't recommend doing that, because if your show is growing, that means that every single episode that you publish is somebody's first episode. If a listener tunes into your show and however they discovered it, maybe their guest shared, maybe they heard you on another podcast, whatever it might be, they press play, they're like, all right, who is this Mark guy? I'm a digital marketer, but I don't really know. Should I be listening to this? And if the first thing that happens when they press play is you're pitching them on buying your product, how do you think that's going to come across, right? They're like, oh, this guy just wants me to buy his thing. I'm going to go listen to Joe Rogan, right? And then you lost them forever. So, because they don't come back, they're not going to give you a second chance. So what I recommend as a podcaster doing is the first 90 seconds of every episode, you have one goal, and that is to sell the listener on listening to the rest of your episode. That's all you are there to do. It's just like, listen, you just made the best decision of your day because here's what you're going to get out of this episode. Here's why this guest is amazing. Here's why you should listen to what they have to say. And here's how this episode is going to benefit you. Now, it sounds like a lot of work. You can do that in literally 60 to 90 seconds. But if instead you pitch them, they're not going to listen to the rest, right? So I would focus the first few, like 1 to 2 minutes of your podcast on selling the listener, convincing them to stay. And then literally anytime after that, you can CTA your thing. What I do on my show is I have my intro and I just like sell the crap out of the rest of the episode and like get you hooked where you're just like, this is going to be amazing. And then I drop my CTA in there and I'm just like, by the way, I'll say something like, if you're an entrepreneur who's already launched their podcast and you already have an offer and you're looking to scale your podcast faster and you don't want to try to blah, 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 and blah, 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 click the link in the show notes, back to the show. So I get my CTA in there. The most people who tune into the episode are going to hear it because I did it so early, but I did the CTA after I've already hooked them and convinced them to listen to the rest of the episode. That's the sweet spot that I have discovered. Just a couple minutes in. Or alternatively, you can do the truly like in the middle where it interrupts the middle of the content. That works really well too. But the fact of the matter, like in summary, I wouldn't do it right at the very beginning or right at the very end.
Oh, that's huge. No, but I love the tip. It's, you sell people on the show first, get them excited, and then you could say, oh, and by the way, I'm doing all this stuff because I have to advertise. I'm not saying that, but that's actually what's happening.
Right,
but people
pretty much
now have some buy-in, so they know like, oh, okay, well, yeah, that makes sense that you do it here because now I'm excited to listen. And if it's relevant, that makes it even better. So I love that. Now, in terms of the length, well, we'll just stick on the call to action. Length of the commercial. Is there music in the background? And for the actual call to action, like what to do you always say link in the notes, or do you ever say like the domain, the URL that people are going to go to?
Yeah, great question. So as far as length goes, there is so one of my podcast growth coaches that works for me is he's like a 25-year veteran in the radio world. And he shared with me that when he worked for a radio station, they did a study to determine like when people get annoyed with ads. And what he shared with me was surprising was that people actually don't get as annoyed with the length of an ad. They get annoyed with the number of ads in a row. So it is more annoying to somebody to hear 4 ads in a 2-minute time frame than it is for 30-second ads than it is to hear 1 ad in 4 minutes. Right. So it's the number of ads. And if you think about like when you're watching TV, when there's like the 5th or 6th commercial in a row, that's when you're like, wow. Right. So that's number one is like, as far as like your listener experience, length doesn't matter as much. I generally recommend to keep them around 1 minute in time because anything above that, you're just kind of rambling, like you can pretty much get in what you need to get in 1 minute. But my little pro tip that I recommend is to make it 1 minute and like 7 seconds. And the reason you do that is because a lot of times when people hear an ad, what do? They hit skip, right? And all of the podcast listening apps, the skip is either 15 seconds, 30 seconds, or 60 seconds. So if they skip your ad and they jump to a minute in the ad and it's right at the CTA, like I said, tiny little optimization pro tip, but those actually perform a little bit better because even the people who press skip still hear the tail end of your CTA. The other question that you asked was about like, show notes, like, do I always add the link? So there's a lot of folks that, that will say, choose a domain that's really easy to remember so that people can remember what it is, right? In my experience, nobody's ever typing in any URL based on something that they heard in a podcast. Like it's extremely, extremely rare. What they will do is they will click on a link in the show notes if you direct them to that. So what I always say is you want to make it as easy as you possibly can for the listener to take the next step in your process, to do the thing that you're asking them to do. And remember, podcasting is a companion medium. So right now, the listener is listening to my voice while they are doing something. Like right now, as I'm talking, you, the listener, are doing something right now, right? So if I said, go click on this link, you would have to put down the barbell, or take the gloves off your hands while you're cleaning. So you want to make it really, really easy to remember, easy to do. That's why I always recommend just click the link in the show notes. That's all you got to do. Go to the show notes, click the link, because if you give them something to type in, like just go to abc.com/podcast, what are the odds that when they're done in the squat rack, when they're done cleaning, they're going to remember what to type in, open up Safari, type it? Like, it's just not happening. So you want to lower the amount of friction it takes to actually take the action, which is why I just recommend just click the link in the show notes. That's all you got to do.
That's such a good explanation, because it's, it seems like, oh, well, if I make the URL simple enough, then people appreciate that and then they'll go to it and blah, blah. But you're totally right. It's making a huge assumption about what people are doing at the moment of listening to a podcast, which rarely coincides with, I'm going to pick that up right now. I'm going to remember it, one, because even if it was so simple, abc.com/123, nobody's going to remember even something that simple. So it has to, I think, link in show notes. That's a great tip, and we'll probably adopt it. So if you do hear a URL or hear me say the URL, we're changing that. It's going to be link in show notes from now on. That's fantastic. Now, last question about that, and we'll have to have you back on the show to actually talk about the podcast growth, which is definitely needed as well. But in regards to just the commercial, have you found that, I don't know, the tone of voice, or, specifically how you deliver the commercial compared to how you're delivering the podcast? Is it different, or is it basically, about the same? Like, hey, it's Mark, I'm always talking on the podcast, so here's a commercial in the same voice, or should it be something different?
Yeah, I just generally recommend the same. And it's for the same reason that I kind of alluded to earlier, which is like the reason why host-read ads perform so well is because the host is so comfortable to the listener. Like, people listen to their favorite podcasts because they love the hosts more so than anything else. And so, the more you can make your CTA sound like you normally sound, the more effective it's going to be, the more you're going to get that benefit. Some people do like to put like a special song underneath to indicate that, hey, this is an ad, this is going to be a CTA, which you can do. Like, it's totally optional. That's your own stylistic choice. I don't find necessarily that there's any difference in conversion when you do that. Some people just like to, make sure that people know when they're doing sponsored content versus not, which is cool. Totally get that, especially when you're doing like affiliate sponsorships. Like, I want to make it clear I'm getting compensated for this. But like, what I wouldn't want to do is like really alter how I sound when I'm doing a CTA, because that just kind of makes it sound inauthentic, right? It's like, oh, what is this? Why is, and also people, like, if you put on the salesy voice, people will be like, oh, he's just trying to sell me something. Whereas if you just talk like you normally talk, and you're just like, hey, and you'll hear my CTA. If you ever listen to the Grow the Show podcast, which is my show, you'll hear my CTAs sound exactly like I talk in the show. I do a lot of voiceovers on the show, and I'll be like, hey, we'll be back to the show in a minute, but real quick, I just wanted to let you know this, blah, 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 CTA. And then, click the link in the show notes. Okay, now back to the show. And that's it. It's simple. People get it. It's me. They know me. And it's really effective.
I love that. Yeah, no, it's always good to hear, things that are big question marks, like, oh, well, should I do this or that? And there's so many different ways you could go, especially when it comes to CTAs and just commercializing your podcast in general. It's good to hear that it's much easier than, you might think it is, right?
I'll reiterate, it's more about just the volume of just mentioning your thing. Like, there is no, like, we are always so much farther away from the line of too much than we think we are. And what I found is that the vast majority of entrepreneurs and podcasters, they're afraid of talking about their products and services too much. And, oh, I did that. I talked about my coaching program 2 months ago, and like, I don't know if I should do it. I'm like, listen, every single episode, it's okay. Like, if people are getting value from your show, like, they get it. They're not going to hate you for talking about your business. In fact, they're probably going to love it. Like, think about it. We, as Americans, consumers, we don't hate ads. We hate irrelevant ads. We hate ads that are just totally not even close to what we want in life. Those are the ones that are annoying. When we hear an ad that's relevant, that actually is something that we might want, We love that. We love to buy stuff. That's what we do, right? We love finding out about new stuff to buy that would get us what we want. So like if your prospects are listening to your show, there's a good chance that they're probably gonna be really interested in hearing about your products and services because they're already there. They like you, they know you, they trust you. So it, like I said, as much as we can talk about the optimizations of the CTA, where to put it, how to talk about it, music underneath, the name of the game is just making them. Make the CTA every episode and you will make more money.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, on the flip side too, if you don't make a CTA and you don't make an effort to commercialize what you're doing, you're going to stop. And your listeners will be way more unhappy with that than if you just threw an ad in there to make it worth your time. They like you.
100%.
Do it.
They want the show to keep existing.
Exactly. And they know you got to make money. They just, it's not a charity. Even if it is a charity, they still want your donation. So no matter what, you need to add that call to action.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. I think this has been fantastic. Great specific tips on kind of how to start monetizing your podcast. Next time, definitely going to have you back on to talk about actually how to grow your show versus, just doing the show. In the meantime, though, where can people learn more about you?
Yeah. So the number one thing to do is to check out my podcast. It's called Grow the Show. Whatever you're using right now to listen to this podcast, it's there. Just search Grow the Show Kevin and it'll come up. If you want to hear my algorithm for how to grow a podcast audience before I have a chance to come back on the show here, you can hear it there. And then the other thing that people can do if they want the crash course on how we grow and monetize podcasts, just growtheshow.com/masterclass. And I'll send you the link to put in the show notes.
A link will be in the show notes. We're starting that today. I think we do that too, but I always I develop websites, so I'm always like, the right URL will get you more traffic. But this has been great. Thank you so much for the tips and really simplifying it, make it less scary than people think it would be.
Awesome. That's the goal. Thanks, Mark.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for listening. Be sure to hit that follow button so you get notified when all of our new episodes release. Please share this with that friend who's clueless about digital marketing. And don't forget to visit digitalmarketer.com where you can access all of our courses, certifications, and training programs. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next time.